Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're going to talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor as part of a wider series we started last week with a discussion of when World War II began and some of the events that historians have showed on a timeline led to World War II. So today we're going to talk about how the United States entered World War II and that first battle of the war for us, and then future videos in this series will continue with other battles down the line. So, Japan was looking for the raw materials that they needed to be an imperial power. As an island nation, they did not have indigenously all of the things they needed. So, around the same time the United States became an imperialist nation, Japan was doing the same thing on the other side of the Pacific. So they took places like Taiwan, Manchuria, and Korea to start to get the resources and the industry and the markets for the goods that they were producing back home. And to protect this new empire, they had to build a navy. One thing they badly needed was oil. The best oil in the area came from the Dutch East Indies. To take those islands, those oil fields, from the Dutch wouldn't be too difficult in theory. The Dutch were being occupied by Nazi Germany. The Japanese had recently taken French Indochina because France was also being occupied by Nazi Germany. However, in their way were the Philippine Islands, which were under the control of the United States. So, Japan realized they had to neutralize the United States Pacific Fleet some way or another, take the Philippine Islands so that there wasn't an enemy stronghold in between their oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and mainland Japan, and then, of course, get a fleet down there to take the Dutch East Indies. There were a couple of ideas, and the United States had a couple of thoughts on what the Japanese were going to do. But as we all know, the route they went with was one that hadn't been widely foreseen in the United States, an attack on Pearl Harbor, neutralizing the United States Pacific Fleet at their home port so that they could not sail across the Pacific and prevent the fall of the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies. That also gave the Japanese enough time to fortify several concentric rings of island bases that would force the United States to fight through outer defenses to get back to their former colonies. So, as war with the United States became inevitable, the Japanese did something that most other countries hadn't thought of. They put the bulk of their carrier fleet into one task force called the Kido Butai. This combined their 6 largest out of 10 aircraft carriers: Akagi, the flagship, Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu, and Shokaku and Zuikaku. And these 6 carriers had the capacity of about 400 aircraft, and they had the deck load for about 200 aircraft at a time. So the Japanese gave them 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 2 fast battleships, some destroyers, some scouting submarines, and some oilers, and sent them to attack Pearl Harbor. At the same time, American and Japanese diplomats were trying to work out an agreement. Had an agreement been reachable, they could have recalled the fleet at any time. And one of the interesting things the Japanese did here was, rather than strike out from the mandate, the Japanese held islands in the Central Pacific, they sent the carriers on a northern route which was not frequented by other shipping, so they would be completely secret. The United States intelligence had no idea where these carriers were. Other ships closer to Japan were broadcasting with the code words assigned to these carriers. But U.S. intelligence figured something was up there, but they couldn't tell where the Japanese carriers were or where they were headed. It still seemed obvious to everyone that the Japanese were going to start the war with an attack on the Philippines, the closest American possession to them, and not in Hawaii, one of the further possessions. So, on the morning of December 7th, the Japanese cruisers launched scout planes to look over the island. Even though the United States was starting to get on a wartime footing because it was a Sunday morning, there were not combat air patrol fighters in the air. There were not other defenses active. Anti-aircraft guns were not manned. There was a radar station, which was brand new, that was up and running and conducting tests that detected the Japanese fleet incoming. But that radar station at Opana Point didn't have proper communications. There wasn't a area to coordinate all the intelligence they were receiving and then make decisions. So even though they got that information, it was assumed that those were American aircraft coming in from the mainland. The Japanese scout planes saw that there were no defenses up, so they sent back the code word, and the main strike force was launched. Because the Japanese could only fit about half of their aircraft on deck at one time, they launched half of their air group. The other half would be positioned on deck, loaded, and a second strike could be launched later. So these two strikes were both comprised of Zeros, or Zeeks, the fighter plane, Kates, which were the torpedo bombers, and Vals, which were the dive bombers. But what these different flights targeted was different with each strike wave. The first strike wave, the Zeros on the combat air patrol were supposed to suppress anti-aircraft gunners by strafing the ships, and also to suppress the American aircraft that were still on the ground, destroy as many on the ground as possible. The Kates, which could be used as either low, slow-flying torpedo planes or high-flying bombers, were primarily used as low, slow-flying torpedo planes at this point in the battle. When the Americans were least prepared, they could go in relatively unmolested and drop torpedoes at the ships of Battleship Row. The dive bombers, on the other hand, were going to be used to attack the airfields primarily, because they could really precisely strike targets. And if they could destroy a lot of the American aircraft on the ground, that would limit a response. With the second wave, when anti-aircraft guns and fighter cover was supposed to be heavier, the Zeros would be flying combat air patrol to engage fighters in the air. The dive bombers would be targeting the ships that hadn't been destroyed by torpedo planes, because they were relatively safe from anti-aircraft fire. It's really hard to shoot one down in a dive. And the torpedo bombers would be used to bomb the airfields, which by that point should be less well defended and already softened up. Some of the torpedo bombers had special wooden fins on their torpedoes, which allowed them to operate in the shallow water of Pearl Harbor. Other ones had converted Japanese 16-inch shells to use as armor-piercing bombs against the ships from high altitude. This wouldn't work against a moving target, but against a fleet of anchored ships not maneuvering, they could drop these bombs from high altitude and expect comparatively good accuracy. So, the American fleet in port that morning was comprised of 8 battleships: Nevada, Arizona, West Virginia and Tennessee, Maryland and Oklahoma, California, and Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock. The other 7 battleships were all on Battleship Row, alongside Ford Island. On the other side of Ford Island was Carrier Row, which, fortunately for the United States, did not have any carriers present. It did have the former battleship come gunnery target ship Utah there, and a pair of light cruisers. There was also Tin Can Alley, north of Ford Island, where all the destroyers were moored out in the channel, and there were the submarine pens and dry dock areas where most of the cruisers were docked. The first Japanese wave achieved complete surprise, was able to do significant damage to the American battleships and some other ships. all of the outboard battleships, which is to say Oklahoma and West Virginia, California and Nevada, were hit to some extent. The inboard battleships couldn't be hit by torpedoes, but were damaged by bombs. The bombs were less effective. For example, the battleship Maryland was hit by 2 bombs and took very little damage. She would be repaired within a couple of months. Remember, the Japanese bombs were 16-inch armor-piercing shells. Maryland had 16-inch guns of her own, which meant she was armored against 16-inch shells. Battleship Arizona, on the other hand, which was moored inboard of the battleship repair ship Vestal, couldn't be hit by torpedoes, so she was targeted with bombs. Arizona was armed with 12 14-inch guns and was therefore armored against 14-inch guns. So the 16-inch shell was able to overmatch her armor, even though it had been reinforced in the 1930s, and caused a detonation of some of her powder magazines up forward. So she went down with 1,177 crew, greatest loss of life on a single U.S. Navy ship, and that made up about half of the American losses in terms of casualties during the battle. So of the American ships, some were able to get underway. Only the Battleship Nevada was able to get underway as far as capital ships go. And as she was steaming down the channel at slow speed, all of the Japanese aircraft that hadn't spent their ordnance chose to attack her. And one suggestion was that they were trying to sink her in the channel. The channel leading into Pearl Harbor is relatively narrow. If you can sink a capital ship there, well, then the rest of the fleet is bottled up in port until you can raise or destroy the obstacle. So Nevada took a lot of heat on her way out of harbor, specifically from second wave planes, and her captain chose to beach her near Hospital Point instead of risk the channel. So only a couple of cruisers and destroyers were able to make it out of port that day, and they searched for the Japanese carriers in vain, but could not find them because they were searching to the west towards the Japanese mandate. They didn't realize that the Japanese were actually to the north. Part of that Japanese deception the Japanese helped with by having their aircraft leave and enter the combat zone in all directions so that the United States didn't know where they were coming from or going. So not only were the ships badly attacked, the various Army, Navy, and Marine Corps airfields around the island were all hit, and a tremendous number of aircraft were lost there. And this represented a pretty significant loss at the time because the United States was still building up to full capacity. So things like the state-of-the-art B-17 Flying Fortresses that were lost there would take months to replace. Even though the number of aircrew lost was relatively low, it was months before there were enough scouting planes, bombers, fighters that could be ferried to Pearl Harbor to defend the area. So, the Japanese recovered their 2 strikes, and they had a pretty decent bomb damage assessment of the damage they had done. And the suggestion was made that they should launch a 3rd strike. The first wave had gotten back to the carrier, rearmed, and could have been launched again to hit Pearl Harbor around noon on the 7th. Admiral Nagumo, who was commanding the Kido Butai, remember this represents a significant investment in Japanese carriers, more than half of them, and the best of them by far in terms of size and training. Didn't want to squander a resource which he knew that the Japanese Empire could not replace in a timely fashion. That resource being both the carriers themselves and the well-trained aircrew. The Japanese, by this point, had lost 19 aircraft and 49 airmen. The aircraft could be replaced, but the airmen were super well-trained from years of combat in China and specifically training for this operation. So if he lost too many of them, it would be really, really hard to replace those guys in any reasonable amount of time. And as it was, you'll see in future videos that this was an issue that the Japanese faced within the first 6 months to a year of the war. So, rather than launch a third strike, which could have attacked repair facilities like the dry docks that were undamaged, or the oil fields that supplied all the ships, and trying to neutralize Pearl Harbor as a base, Nagumo chose to withdraw while he was still undetected and hadn't lost too many resources. After all, he had achieved unqualified success beyond anyone's expectations. It has also been suggested that if the Japanese could invade Hawaii during this attack, well, then that would push the United States out of the war. This is another thing that wasn't particularly possible. The Japanese were already using all the transports and troops they could to try and take the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and those island barriers. They didn't really have the resources to spare to attack Pearl Harbor. A rebuttal to that would be, why didn't they just attack Pearl Harbor first, and then they could operate behind the scenes at will without the United States being able to do anything? Well, the answer to that is the United States could do something. We had a fleet of ships called the Asiatic Squadron based in the Philippines. So even if Pearl Harbor was neutralized, these ships then operating behind the Japanese lines could pose a serious threat to the Japanese. And that'll be the topic of our next video, the U.S. Asiatic Squadron and the Joint Allied Command that was formed around the Dutch East Indies in late 1941, early 1942. So tune back in next week for that. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Check the description down below for ways that you can donate to support the museum and the channel. And tune back in later for more content.